Welcome to the virtual lunch. Today is Thursday, February 18th, and this is virtual lunch number 243. We are honored that Stuart Clarke, the Chief Technology Officer and Global Head of Security Intelligence for Nuix, is joining us as our guest as part of our series on global connections. So welcome, Stuart.
Thank you. I did a digital forensics degree back in the day. And after 2 years of that degree, I joined a small startup consultancy company in the UK who came up with this novel idea of doing digital forensics and cybersecurity and helping law enforcement deal with this ever-growing challenge, which was people conducting crime using digital devices. So I got into doing digital forensics and investigations back then. The earliest investigation I can remember, I was dealing with 4 gigabytes of data in total, which I had to investigate, which by today's standards is nothing. But it felt like a lot at the time, and that was an awful lot of data for one individual. So I did a lot of incident response type work and cybersecurity work, actually when no one really cared. It wasn't very sexy back then. It wasn't very interesting back then. But did some exciting things, lots of crawling around in data centers, trying to find out how people hacked into various different websites and data centers. So that was all good fun. And I suddenly became a customer of Nuix back in 2008. So I was one of the early customers of Nuix globally, but also particularly in Europe. And that was the first time I got to meet people like Stuart, David Sitsky. And I feel very privileged as a customer because David Sitsky, as obviously chief engineer, the founder, was responding to my support tickets, which was quite novel to have. Little did I realize how small Nuix was back then. So I got very close with David and Stephen and others. After a while of being a customer, I decided to join Nuix about 8 years ago. My role really when I joined Nuix was to help broaden our use cases and the variety of things we did. We were very proven in data processing and e-discovery, and given my background in cybersecurity and investigations, my role really was to help a team of people and to work with a team of people to broaden our capability in that space. My role at the moment is very focused actually towards working with corporations and law firms, particularly around Europe. It's pretty fun, pretty exciting. I was doing investigations, helping law enforcement, just run-of-the-mill type criminal work. And we got a phone call about a very, very large data breach. And I was pretty much the only one in the office. There was 2 of us and we responded to it and we drove up to the data center. There was no process, there was no guidelines. There's 1,000 servers in this room. Figure out how we got hacked and figure out how many credit card numbers were stolen. And I really enjoy challenges like that. It's kind of write your own script within some kind of parameters. And the thrill of the chase is also quite fun. Pretty smart people break into things. So to try and figure out how they did it and stop them stealing data, that was also quite interesting. I mean, everyone's talking about blockchain, but the mass market's not really embracing it and know how to use it and what to do with it. Blockchain as a technology is still something that it's quite sexy and interesting, but it's poorly understood. Certainly, there's a lot of opportunity around that. The other thing that's interesting is with the emergence of 5G technology, the mobile devices that we're so dependent on store a lot of data today. I do wonder in the future with the introduction of 5G and better connectivity, just how important data will be that exists on the web and in the cloud rather than on devices themselves. That's something that's still a bit of an unknown, but also certainly it does interest me actually. I think mobile devices are so important to people today. There's a lot of data on them. So from an investigation and discovery standpoint, they're a critically important device, but in the future, if we can always connect to the internet, how much data will actually be on those devices? That's definitely an avenue to explore in the future. If I was to predict something, might be wildly wrong. These things always go in different directions, but there are a couple of things that interest me. There was one on sustainability, actually, which is a topic that's quite close to my heart for businesses in the future. Forward-thinking companies will be thinking about how do we offset that carbon footprint? Do we plant trees? What do we do? And that's an increasingly important topic for corporations to start thinking about. Outside of my life at Nuix, I'm a board member at a UK-based charity. And our focus, it's really around conservation, but very specifically rhino conservation. Rhinos are pretty much one of the oldest species on the planet. Been around for an awful long time. They're basically a prehistoric animal and they're on the brink of extinction. There's several species of rhinos. Some have already gone extinct. Not enough people know about extinction. Not enough people understand how important it is. Really, up until this year, I don't think anyone's really thought that closely about how things in different parts of the world, like Africa and Asia, actually will impact us here in our cities, in our homes. So working with the charity really was key for me. I wanted to raise awareness of this, do everything I could. Which as a charity, our vision is not to just do one thing. Stopping poaching is critical, rehabilitating orphan rhinos, including the community in conservation efforts, and providing education and jobs to the communities as well is really important. There's so much value that can be gleaned by supporting any type of initiative. Sometimes it's good to pause and give back and see success and rewards come from different places. It's always interesting to look outside of the likes of the US, Canada, UK, and what other countries are doing. So early in my career at Nuix, actually, I was lucky enough to work with the United Nations, who have a dedicated body to help developing countries deal with cybersecurity attacks, who don't have the competencies and the investment that the likes of the US or the UK might have, but then still is vulnerable. There's dedicated bodies in those countries focused on cybersecurity. I visited Laos 6 years ago, one of the poorest countries in the world, but I trained over 100 different member states over the course of a few years. And I would rank Laos cybersecurity computer emergency response team as one of the most competent I'd come across at the time, actually. Very forward thinking, really ahead of the curve, really thinking about all kinds of things from a security perspective, such as state-sponsored attacks, attacks from within. They were really quite mature. And I thought that was quite fascinating that as a very poor country, they were trying to differentiate themselves in the Asia space as kind of a thought leader ahead of the likes of Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam, who arguably are much better, stronger economies. But Laos thought, we're just over the border from China and we're not that far away from North Korea. We've got lots of developing nations around us. How can we differentiate? And it seemed like that was a really important thing for their government. Everyone approaches things differently. The nuances across different countries is absolutely critical. And a key thing is trust. Sharing is really important because what's happening here in Europe might be incredibly relevant to what needs to happen in the US from a security standpoint. The level of trust from a security standpoint, it's something that if it eroded in the future would be quite damaging to people, to be honest. I'm not endorsing that we should be a surveillance state in any way, shape or form, but there's key things that I think as long as different countries are talking, those cultural nuances and the distance between the different cultures reduces slightly. So there's a better understanding, really. I want to talk about crypto and blockchain because that's tied to money and it's tied to security and it's tied to trust. Blockchain's not necessarily new. The concept of it's been around a long time, but blockchain was applied to currency and the emergence of cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency as a concept is also not overly novel. But not too long ago, you would walk around with cash and it was decentralized and it was anonymous and people liked that. Then we moved to debit cards and checks, and then the banks had visibility and control. That was good for a lot of people, but a lot of people don't like that because then suddenly everything's centralized again, all the money's centralized with the banks, etc. Positives to that is it's regulated, but because a lot of people don't like it's centralized, blockchain developed and cryptocurrencies developed as well, which very simple terms, cryptocurrency is basically the old coins that we used to have back in the day, the bag of coins, but it's digital and it's completely anonymous. It can't be tracked back to you. It's decentralized, so banks can't control it. So for a lot of people, that's good, but for regulators and banks, that's a problem. But it's interesting how that interplays with security because that's people making a decision rather than banks and regulators making a decision about security. And obviously at the moment, regulators are taking a closer look at it. A lot of banks don't tolerate it. I feel that's going to be a fascinating wrestle in the future. A lot of developing countries are adopting cryptocurrencies as transactions that have high inflation and challenges with currency. The other thing from a security standpoint is as a society, we've become more and more rightly obsessed with privacy, and we've become more and more aware about privacy and what data people hold about us and what dangers that could pose. As a consequence, people are embracing encryption. Encryption's becoming better. Quantum computing is going to take that to the next level, I think. But you've just got to look at the reaction a couple of weeks ago to Facebook and WhatsApp changing their terms and conditions. Pretty much overnight, millions of people left WhatsApp and downloaded Signal as a messaging app. People just are fed up with not having security, not having privacy. That would never have happened 5 years ago. We were blissfully unaware of just some of the dangers as a general population. That's going to be an interesting challenge in the future. And for law enforcement, that's going to represent a real challenge. If people are using apps like Signal, which are fully encrypted end to end, how do you investigate crimes? How do you regulate markets when everything's encrypted? That's a challenge that I feel that's going to come sooner rather than later.
Stuart Clarke, everybody. That was fantastic. And thanks, of course, to Nuix for supporting our conversations on global connections.